long days of April had been full of mist and rain. Occasionally, for a few hours, there would come a miracle of blue sky or white clouds penetrated by that warm yellow light that came from the heavens. But for the most part, the rain would fall and a cloud of fog surrounded the valleys that were scattered throughout the vast Appalachian wilderness. Onward he walked, following the animal trails that ran along the banks of the Obed River towards his neighbor's house. He swung his machete into the thick mountain laurel and went stalking on. Up ahead, nearer the mouth of the river, stood the run-down cabin that was dug into the side of Windrock Mountain, with its door wide open. This was his destination. Now, he already knew what awaited him on the inside, but still, he called out to announce his arrival as he slowly approached. Yet, his ears only met with silence in return. Slowly, he crept closer to his neighbor's cabin, and finally, he peered into the blackness of the unlit room. The handle of his blade was gripped tightly in his hand. Inside, there were 3 spiritless bodies. A gaunt mountaineer, along with his son and daughter. Their souls, they had already abandoned their aching earthly flesh and had taken to that long flight into the unknown. It was just as he had been told. The fever had been spreading across Windrock like wildfire and had taken them all. He paused to pay his respects, but just then he felt the presence of someone else in the room, and there in the far corner was a young boy cradling the head of a lifeless woman in his arms. "Are you okay, Zeke?" the man softly called out. "Well, she just kind of got tired. They all did," was all the orphan boy would say. The only living soul that remained on the homestead was a mountain boy named Zeke with his dog Coy. Up the hill from the cabin, the sound of shovels could be heard. Several men had been digging the entire morning. "It's time, son," the neighbor said as he put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and with Coy at his heels, they trudged up to the point of a wooded spur above the cabin, where, at the foot of a giant poplar tree, there were 3 piles of rough boards, loosely covering 3 fresh piles of rain-beaten earth, and near them was a large, open grave. There was no service sung or spoken prayers for the dead, for the closest preacher was days away, and there Zeke stood behind the big poplar, watching the neighbors gently let down into the shallow trench 4 homemade coffins, containing everyone in the cabin but him. The young boy doubled his fist into his eyes and stumbled backwards in disbelief against the gnarled roots of mountain laurel until he became so weak that he dropped onto a thick velvet mat of moss and sobbed himself to sleep. When he awoke, Coy was licking his face as he sat up, dazed and yawning. The sun was dropping fast. The ravines were filling with blue shadows, luminous and misty, and just then he heard a far-away, drowsy tinkling from the valley that told him that the family's cow was starting homeward. From habit, he sprang quickly to his feet to set about his daily chore, but that was only for a moment, before his mind snapped back to the present, and he slowly dropped back on the moss again, while his faithful dog, who had started down the spur, circled back to see what was the matter. There had been a consultation about Zeke earlier that morning among the hill folks and neighbors, and Squire Parsons, the old man who ran the only water mill in this section, said that he would take charge of the boy, but only on count that the boy's uncle had owed the old man money prior to his death. And after all, in such cases as these, it was common for an orphan child to become the property of a creditor for a period of at least 7 years. Squire Parsons hadn't even bothered to show up for the funeral, but he sent word for Zeke to stay one more night in the death-stricken cabin alone, and he would pick him up in his wagon the next morning. And now, Zeke's troubles were even worse, since everyone on Windrock Mountain knew that the old squire hated dogs, and Zeke thought about how mean that old man had been to him in the past. The last place he could imagine himself was living with that dirty old man, where he'd be forced to be at his beck and call from sunup to sundown for the next 7 years. By early afternoon, all the menfolk had completed the sorrowful deed, and they mounted their horses and disappeared back to their usual routine for the day. Now alone, Zeke looked back at the hut that had been his home, and under that poplar tree, Coy sniffed curiously at the fresh pile of dirt that covered the new grave. Zeke called him away so sharply that Coy's tail drooped, and he crept towards his master as if though to ask for a pardon for a fault of which he wasn't even sure of. And for a moment, Zeke stood looking down at the grave. Again, his eyes filled and a lump swelled in his throat so much that he felt like he could hardly breathe before he turned away and walked back to the open door of the cabin. Inside, it was deathly still. The homespun bedclothes and homemade quilts of brilliant colors had been thrown into a heap on one of the 2 hickory bedsteads. The kitchen utensils, a few pots and pans, had been piled on the fireplace, along with strings of herbs and beans and red pepper pods that were still hanging in front of the windows. Not a living thing was to be seen or heard that even suggested human life, and Zeke sat down in deepening loneliness, watching the shadows rise up the green walls that bound him in, and his mind began to torment him. Well, what should I do? Where should I go? In many ways, this was the first time that the mountain boy had ever thought seriously about himself, or wondered who he was, or where he'd come from, or where he was going. And the mind is a tricky thing, and stricken with sorrow, it was hard for Zeke to know what was real and what was an illusion. Digging back into his memory as far as he could, it seemed that this entire tragedy had happened to him once before, and that he had simply wandered away. But he couldn't remember where he had started from first. But he could recall many of the places that he had lived and why he had left them. It was usually because of somebody, like the old squire, wanting to have him bound out, or they misused Coy. But he had stayed at the longest at this place he was at now, because his uncle and his son and girl had all taken a great fancy to Coy, and they had let the 2 guard the cattle in the mountains and drive sheep. And even if the boy and his dog stayed out in the forest overnight, he never got whipped or even a single tongue lashing. And what's more, the woman who had been his aunt was almost like a mother to him. Once more, Zeke leaned his head towards a worn quilt and cried silently. So far, nobody had even seemed to care, particularly who he was, or for that matter, who he wasn't. In his young life, most folks had been kind to him and took him in, looking upon him as one of the many wandering souls that wandered throughout the Cumberland Mountains. And now, the most important question loomed as to where he should start walking with his feet. He would have to summon that restless spirit that had once led his unknown ancestors into the mountain wilds after the American Revolution. No, there was no way that Zeke would be bound to become Squire Parsons' servant, especially if it meant losing his dog. A spirit was so bound up inside of the boy that he rose with sharp decision. And just up above him and across some buck antlers over the door laid a long flintlock rifle, a bullet pouch, a powder horn, and a small raccoon skin sack that hung from one of the prongs. And on them, the boy's eyes rested longingly. Squire and his claims that the dead man had owed him money. Oh, he would surely take this gun and everything else of value in the morning. Zeke reached up and took down the gun. Uncle John would have wanted me to have this, he said to himself as he gripped it firmly in his hands. The rifle, he knew, was always loaded, and there wasn't much powder in the horn, and there was probably less than a dozen bullets in that pouch, but they would last at least till he could get far away. I won't take any more than I can carry, he thought to himself, and with that, he grabbed a blanket from the bed, and from the fireplace, he grabbed the last slice of bacon and piece of cornbread. I know Aunt Jane wouldn't have mattered about me taking these little fixings, and I know I earned them anyways. And then he took one last look before walking out of the cabin and closing the door for good.
Get someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 2 volumes packed with stories that'll make your heart smile. Visit theappalachiachannel.com to pick up your copy today.
With this Barlow knife, he swiftly stripped a bark string from a pawpaw bush that was nearby, which he folded and tied around his blanket. And then he swung his little pack over his shoulder. And that's when the sound of the cowbell approached through the bushes. It was old Nance. She had made it home, even though Zeke had forgotten about her. And it was getting late, but he was anxious to leave for fear that some neighbor might come and try to stop him. But there was no one left to milk the old girl, and when she drew near with a low moo, he saw that she was full and dripping. Oh, it would hurt her to let her go unmilked. So he put his things down, and so strong was the habit inside of him that he did the task thoroughly, putting the strippings in a cup and hurried with both down to the crude spring house and set them in the cool running water. A moment later, he had his pack and his rifle on one shoulder, and he was climbing the fence at the wood pile. There, he paused to wrench a short axe from the face of a hickory log. And then, under the weight of his weapons, Zeke and Coy staggered up Windrock Mountain for nearly 2 miles until he was completely exhausted. The sun was nearly gone, and now eerie shadows spread across the valley below, wrapping it in darkness. And on the spur, he leaned his rifle against a chestnut tree, and taking his axe, he gathered some wood and built a small fire, where he and Coy shared the last single strip of bacon and cornbread. And when the last bite was gone, Zeke bowed his head and set about talking frankly out loud to God. Lord, you know I wouldn't do anything to cross you, and I reckon you know, but I'm gonna run away. I ain't got no one here for me, and I ain't never had no one that I can really remember except Aunt Jane. But they're all gone now. It seems like all I do is bring folks bad luck. And Lord, as far as I can figure, I reckon you're trying to tell me that my days of being a boy are over, and now's the time for me to become a man. I promise you, God, I'll do my best not to let you down. Amen. With that, he opened his eyes and lifted his head. In the quiet, Zeke sat by the dying embers, his rifle and Coy close to his side. The fire's glow flickered against his weary face, but his eyes burned with something deeper, a quiet defiance, an ember that refused to go out. Above him, the stars stretched wide and endless, whispering promises that only the lost and lonely could hear. And then he gripped his rifle tighter. Come morning, I reckon I'll be long gone, he muttered as Coy lifted his head at the sound of his voice. But somewhere beyond that ridge, past the tangled laurel and dark hollows, the shadows waited, and Zeke knew that this was just the beginning.